When my daughter-in-law asked me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I was used to swallowing pain. I had spent years giving love quietly, without asking for anything back. That Christmas morning felt different. Even before the gifts appeared, laughter filled the room, but something was missing. I sat there smiling, waiting, realizing no one noticed me waiting. It wasn't about presents, it was about being forgotten. And in that silence, I understood how invisible I had become. Before we continue the story, I want to speak to you for a moment. If you're listening right now, thank you for being here with me. This is a safe, quiet space for real feelings and real stories. If these stories touch your heart, please like this video. And if you want more gentle stories like this, consider subscribing. Sometimes we need stories that understand silent pain, stories that sit with us, not rush us. Now, take a deep breath and let me continue. Let me tell you who I am, so you can understand why this hurt the way it did. I have always been a quiet woman, not because I had nothing to say, but because I learned early that listening kept the peace. I grew up believing love was shown through actions, not words. I was the kind of person who noticed small things. If someone looked tired, I remembered. If someone mentioned a favorite food once, I never forgot it. Caring for others felt natural to me, like breathing. I spent most of my life taking care of my family. I cooked meals even when my feet hurt. I stayed up late when someone was sick. I put my own needs aside without thinking twice. I married young. Like many women of my time, I believed my purpose was to build a home that felt safe. And I did my best. I wasn't perfect, but my heart was always in the right place. When my son was born, my world changed. I remember holding him for the first time, afraid and amazed at the same time. I promised myself that no matter what happened in life, he would always feel loved. I worked hard to keep that promise. As he grew, I learned how quickly time moves. One day he needed me for everything. The next, he was standing on his own. I was proud of him. I still am. When he married, I told myself I would welcome his wife as my own. I knew how difficult it could be to join a new family. I didn't want her to feel judged or compared, so I stayed gentle. I stayed respectful. 81st, things were good. We shared meals. We laughed over small stories. I helped when the children were born, holding them while she rested. I felt useful again, needed. Becoming a grandmother softened me in ways I can't explain. Those little hands wrapped around my fingers made everything else fade away. I told myself I would always be there for them quietly, without asking for anything in return. Christmas was always special to me. Even before grandchildren, I loved the season, not for the noise or the shopping, but for the feeling of closeness it brought. I loved waking up early, before anyone else. The house felt different then, still peaceful. I liked preparing small things that no one noticed. Warm tea on the stove, extra blankets folded neatly, food ready before anyone asked. Those were my ways of saying I love you. I never expected praise. I didn't need thank you speeches. Seeing my family comfortable was enough. That was how I measured my worth. For a long time, I felt included. I had a place at the table. I had a role. Even if it was small, it mattered to me. But slowly, things began to change. Not in a dramatic way. No arguments. No harsh words. Just small shifts. Conversations didn't last as long when I entered the room. Plans were discussed without looking my way. Decisions were already made by the time I heard about them. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being too sensitive, that everyone was busy. I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want to seem demanding. So I smiled. I nodded. I stayed quiet. When holidays came, I still showed up early. I still brought food. I still wrapped gifts carefully, thinking about what each person might enjoy. I still told myself this was enough. I noticed that fewer questions were asked about my life. No one asked how I was feeling. No one asked if I needed anything. But I told myself this was just part of getting older, that parents naturally fade into the background as children build their own lives. I convinced myself this was normal. I never wanted to be a burden. That word scared me more than loneliness. So I worked hard to make myself easy to have around. Low maintenance, invisible when needed. Deep down, There were moments that stung, moments when I felt like a guest instead of family, moments when I felt tolerated rather than welcomed, but I pushed those feelings away because love to me meant patience, and patience meant staying silent. I loved my family deeply. That love never changed. Even when I felt less seen, my heart stayed open. I never imagined that love could exist alongside feeling forgotten. I thought one canceled the other out. I was wrong. By the time that Christmas arrived, I was already carrying years of quiet adjustments, years of lowering expectations, years of telling myself I didn't need much. So when I walked into that living room on Christmas morning, I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't looking for praise. I wasn't even looking for a gift. I was just looking for a sign that I still mattered, that I was still part of the circle, that my place hadn't disappeared, and I had no idea how fragile that feeling truly was. Looking back now, I can see that the change did not begin that Christmas. It started much earlier, so quietly that I barely noticed it at first. And maybe that was why it hurt so much later. At the beginning, it was just small things, little moments that felt strange but easy to ignore. Moments I told myself did not matter. There were times I would walk into a room and the conversation would slow down, not stop completely, just soften, like someone turning the volume down. I told myself it was nothing. People pause sometimes. People forget what they were saying. There was no reason to read into it. When plans were made, I often found out later, not because anyone was hiding them from me. That's what I told myself. Just because things move fast, and I move slower now. If I asked a question, the answer was polite but short. No details, no follow-up. I smiled and nodded. I didn't want to sound curious in the wrong way. I began to notice that I was speaking less, not because I had less to say, but because it felt like my words landed softly and disappeared, like dropping a pebble into deep water. When I offered help, sometimes it was accepted, sometimes it wasn't, and when it wasn't, no explanation was given, just a gentle, "It's fine, we've got it." I told myself that was a good thing. It meant they didn't need me to worry. It meant they were capable. Still, there were moments when I felt unnecessary, not unwanted, just extra. During family meals, I noticed my plate was filled last. No one meant anything by it, I'm sure of that. But small patterns have a way of speaking. When I shared a memory, it was met with polite smiles. Then the conversation moved on. I learned to shorten my stories. Then I learned not to tell them at all. I started arriving a little later than before, leaving a little earlier. I told myself I was being considerate, giving them space inside. I was learning how to shrink. I remember one afternoon clearly. I was sitting at the kitchen table while my daughter-in-law moved around the room. She was busy. I could see that. I asked softly, "Do you need help with anything?" She didn't look up when she answered, "No, it's okay." Her voice wasn't unkind, just distant, like we were standing in different rooms. I stayed seated, my hands rested in my lap. I didn't know what else to do. There were days I felt like a guest in a home I once helped build. I waited to be invited into conversations, into decisions, into moments. Sometimes that invitation never came. I told myself this was what growing older looked like, that parents slowly step aside, that children take over. I reminded myself not to compare the past with the present. That comparison only leads to pain. So I focused on being grateful. Grateful for seeing my grandchildren. Grateful for shared meals. Grateful for being included at all. Still, there were quiet moments when my chest felt heavy. Moments when I wondered if anyone noticed how quiet I had become. I didn't talk about these feelings with anyone. Not my friends. Not my family. They felt too small to mention, yet too heavy to carry easily. I didn't want to be misunderstood. I didn't want to sound like I was complaining. So I kept everything inside. During holidays, this feeling grew stronger. Holidays bring people together, but they also show you where you stand. Who is expected? Who is remembered? I noticed that traditions I once helped create were changing. Not wrong, just different. New foods, new schedules, new ways of doing things. And no one asked me what I thought, and I didn't offer. I smiled through it all, because Smiling was easier than explaining a feeling I barely understood myself. There were nights I lay awake, replaying small moments, not dramatic ones, just looks, pauses, silences. I asked myself if I had done something wrong, if I had said too much at some point, or not enough. I wondered if being quiet had slowly erased me, or if I had erased myself trying not to be a problem. Still, every time I visited, I brought something with me. Food, a small gift, a warm gesture. Giving made me feel useful, needed, present. I told myself love did not need to be returned in the same way to be real. That love could exist even if it wasn't noticed. But deep down, I was tired. Tired of guessing. Tired of adjusting. Tired of pretending not to feel the distance growing. By the time Christmas season approached that year, I already felt fragile, not broken, just thin, like a thread stretched too long. Still, I was hopeful. Christmas has a way of doing that. It makes you believe things will feel warmer again. I told myself, this will be different. I told myself, we'll all be together. I told myself, that's what matters. I didn't know that all those small moments I had ignored were quietly leading me somewhere painful. And I had no idea that Christmas morning would bring all of them into focus at once. When December arrived, the air felt colder than usual, not just outside, but inside me too. Still, I welcomed the season the way I always had, with hope, even if it felt fragile. I began preparing for Christmas early. That was my habit. I liked taking my time, thinking carefully about each person. I wanted every gift to feel thoughtful, not rushed. I walked through stores slowly, even when my legs grew tired. I stopped in aisles longer than necessary, holding items in my hands and imagining who might like them. I paid attention to small details, colors, textures, things someone once mentioned in passing. For my grandchildren, I chose things that would make them smile. Not loud toys, just simple ones. Things they could hold, read, or keep. I imagined their faces lighting up, and that was enough to warm my heart. For my son, I picked something practical, something he could use. I remembered how he always appreciated things that made life easier. I wrapped it carefully, smoothing every fold. For my daughter-in-law, I spent the most time deciding. I didn't want to get it wrong. I wanted her to feel seen. I chose something gentle, something useful but thoughtful. As I placed each gift in my cart, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was how I showed love, not with words, but with care. At home, I wrapped the gifts slowly. I laid the paper flat. I folded the edges neatly. I tied each ribbon with intention. I wrote names carefully on each tag. My handwriting isn't as steady as it used to be, but I took my time. I wanted everything to look nice. As the pile grew, I noticed something. All the names were theirs. I paused for a moment, holding a pen in my hand. I waited for the feeling to pass. I told myself it didn't matter. No one had asked me what I wanted, but that wasn't unusual. I rarely spoke about my wants anyway. Still, a small thought crossed my mind. Just for a second. Maybe they're planning something. Maybe they want it to be a surprise. That thought comforted me, so I held on to it. When we talked about Christmas plans, the conversations felt shorter than before. Times were decided quickly. Details were already set. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't want to complicate anything. There were moments I almost said something, almost asked a simple question. But each time, I stopped myself. I didn't want to seem like I expected anything. I didn't want to put pressure on anyone. I told myself, you don't need gifts to feel loved. I reminded myself that presence was what mattered. That being together was enough. As Christmas grew closer, I noticed I wasn't as excited as I used to be. I still smiled. I still prepared, but something felt different. I baked a few things, like I always did. Cookies, small treats. I packed them carefully, making sure nothing would break. When I brought them over, they thanked me politely. The words were kind, but the warmth felt thinner. I watched my grandchildren play while the adults talked around me. Their laughter filled the room. I focused on that. Night alone, I found myself thinking more than usual, not worrying, just thinking. I wondered when I stopped feeling like a part of things, and when I started feeling like someone passing through. I told myself not to ruin the season with heavy thoughts. This was Christmas, a time for peace. So I pushed those feelings aside and kept preparing, kept showing up, kept giving. On Christmas Eve, I laid out my clothes for the morning. Simple, comfortable, nothing special. I sat on the edge of my bed for a moment, looking at them. I felt calm, nervous, hopeful. I told myself tomorrow would be nice, quiet, warm. I reminded myself that love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's silent. That night, as I turned off the light, I whispered a small hope to myself. Just one, that tomorrow I would feel like I belonged. I didn't know how much that hope would matter a few hours later. Christmas morning came quietly. No alarm, no rush, just a soft light coming through the window and the feeling that the day had already begun without me. I got dressed slowly. I chose the clothes I had laid out the night before. They felt comfortable, familiar. When I arrived, the house was already awake. The smell of coffee filled the air. The tree lights were on, glowing softly in the corner of the room. Everything looked warm, inviting. I smiled as I walked in. I greeted everyone gently. They smiled back, polite, kind. I took my place on the couch, the same spot I always sat in, close enough to see everyone, far enough not to be in the way. The children were excited. Their energy filled the room. I loved watching them. Their joy reminded me why I loved Christmas in the first place. Soon, the gifts were brought out, boxes and bags placed near the tree, paper rustling, voices rising with anticipation. My daughter-in-law picked up the first gift. She smiled and read the name aloud. Not mine. I watched as it was handed over. The wrapping paper was torn carefully, then quickly. Laughter followed. A thank you was said. Another gift was picked up. Another name called. Still not mine. I folded my hands together in my lap. I sat up a little straighter. I told myself there was no reason to feel anything yet. Sometimes people like to save one gift for the end. Sometimes they wait. I believed that. So I waited. More gifts were opened. More smiles. More soft laughter. I clapped quietly when someone looked pleased. I smiled when they smiled. I felt proud watching my family enjoy the morning. The pile of gifts grew smaller. The space under the tree slowly cleared. I noticed the paper collecting on the floor. Bright colors mixed together. Footsteps stepping over it without thought. I felt time slow down. One more gift was opened. Then another. I looked toward the tree again. There was nothing left. No one looked at me. The room didn't stop. Conversation continued. Someone mentioned coffee. Someone laughed. I stayed still for a brief moment. I wondered if I had misunderstood something. Maybe my gift was in another room. Maybe someone had forgotten to bring it out. I waited for someone to say my name, even softly. They didn't. I looked down at my hands again. They were resting in my lap, just as they had been all morning. Empty. A strange calm washed over me. Not peace, just stillness. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face gentle. I didn't want to change the mood. I didn't want to draw attention. I told myself to breathe, slowly, quietly. No one noticed the moment pass. It belonged only to me. I smiled when someone spoke to me. I nodded when someone mentioned how nice the morning was. I agreed. Inside, something had shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly. It felt like a door closing very softly. I realized then that the pain wasn't about not receiving a gift. It was about not being thought of, not being included in a moment that mattered. I had given so much care to everyone else's gifts. I had wrapped them with love. I had imagined their smiles. And yet, here I was, sitting in the same room, feeling unseen. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I stayed quiet, because that was what I had learned to do best. And as Christmas morning moved forward, I understood that this silence would stay with me far longer than the holiday itself. What hurt the most was not the empty space in my hands. I want to say that clearly. It wasn't about boxes or paper or ribbons. I had lived long enough to know that gifts come and go. What hurt was the feeling that settled inside me afterward. The feeling of being unseen, of being forgotten in a room full of people who once knew me so well. I sat there while the morning continued. Coffee was poured. Plates were brought out. The children moved on to their toys. Life went on as if nothing had happened. And maybe, to everyone else, nothing had. I listened to the conversations around me. They sounded normal, light, comfortable. I answered when someone spoke to me. I smiled when expected. I said all the right things. Inside, I was holding myself very carefully, like something fragile that could crack if handled too roughly. I kept telling myself not to take it personally. People forget things. People get busy. Mistakes happen. But this didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like an absence. I thought about all the years before this one, all the holidays I had shown up for, all the meals I had cooked, all the care I had given without being asked. I remembered the late nights, the early mornings, the quiet sacrifices no one ever saw. I never expected repayment. I never kept score, but I had believed those things meant something. As I sat there, I realized something painful. Love does not always protect you from being overlooked. Sometimes love makes you easier to forget. That thought stayed with me, heavy, uncomfortable. At one point, I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I closed the door gently behind me. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my face. I didn't recognize the expression at first. It wasn't sadness alone, it was understanding. I took a deep breath, then another. I told myself not to cry, not because crying is wrong, but because I didn't want to explain my tears. I washed my hands slowly. I straightened my clothes. I practiced my smile until it looked real again. When I returned to the living room, no one noticed I had been gone. That hurt too. In a quiet way, I sat back down. I watched my grandchildren play. I focused on their laughter. But something inside me had shifted. I could feel it clearly now. I realized that I had been shrinking for a long time, making myself smaller to fit into spaces that no longer made room for me, lowering my expectations until they almost disappeared. And even then, it hadn't been enough. I understood that morning that being kind and patient does not always mean being valued. Sometimes it just means being easy to overlook. That realization did not make me angry. It made me tired of guessing where I stood, tired of pretending I didn't notice the distance, tired of convincing myself that my feelings didn't matter. I stayed until it felt polite to leave. I hugged everyone goodbye. I wished them a happy day. My voice sounded steady, even to me. But as I walked away, I knew something important had ended. Not my love for them. That was still there. But the version of myself that believed staying quiet would keep me included. That Christmas morning didn't break me, but it opened my eyes. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. The days after Christmas felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful quiet, just empty. When I returned home that afternoon, I moved slowly. I took off my shoes and placed them neatly by the door, the way I always did. The house greeted me with silence. I turned on a small lamp instead of the main light. The softer glow felt easier on my eyes and on my heart. I sat down without taking off my coat. I stayed there longer than I meant to, just breathing, just listening to the quiet. At first, I told myself I was tired, that the day had simply worn me out. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. That night, I did not turn on the television. I didn't want noise. I didn't want distractions. I made a cup of tea and held it in both hands. The warmth felt comforting, but it didn't reach very far inside me. I kept replaying the morning in my mind. Not the laughter, not the food, just that one moment. The moment when the gifts were gone and nothing was left for me. I told myself again that it shouldn't matter, that I was being silly, that many people had far worse problems. But feelings don't disappear just because we tell them to. They sit quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. That night, sleep came slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, the living room appeared again. The tree, the couch, my empty hands. I wasn't crying. I wasn't upset in the way people expect. I was just awake. The next morning, I woke later than usual. The light through the window told me the day had already begun. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling. There was no rush to get up. No one waiting for me. No plans to follow. I made breakfast for myself. Something simple. Toast. Tea. I ate slowly, Sitting alone at the table, I notice how quiet chewing sounds when there's no conversation around it. As the day passed, I tried to go about my routine. I folded laundry, I wiped down the counters, I watered the plants, but everything felt slower, heavier. I kept thinking about all the times I had told myself I didn't need anything, all the times I had stepped back so others could move forward. I wondered when I stopped allowing myself to be seen. I didn't hear from anyone that day. No message asking if I got home safely. No call to say thank you again. I told myself they were busy, that the holiday season is always full. Still, the silence spoke louder than words. The second day after Christmas was harder. The decorations were still up, lights still blinking softly. They felt out of place now, like reminders of something that had already passed. I took down a few decorations, not all of them, just enough to make the room feel less festive. As I wrapped the ornaments carefully and placed them back in their box, my hands moved slowly. Each ornament held a memory. Each one reminded me of a time when I felt more included. I sat on the floor for a moment, holding one in my hand. It was old, slightly chipped. I remembered hanging it years ago with my son when he was still small. He had laughed when it slipped from his fingers. I smiled at the memory, then the smile faded. I realized that time does not just move forward, it also moves away. That afternoon, I took a short walk outside. The air was cold, clean. People passed me on the sidewalk, wrapped in coats, talking quietly. Everyone seemed to be moving somewhere with purpose. I walked slowly, not really headed anywhere, just moving. I thought about my place in the world, not in a dramatic way, just honestly. I had spent so many years defining myself by what I gave, what I did for others who needed me. And now, without realizing it, I had become someone who wasn't needed in the same way anymore. That truth settled into me gently, painful, but clear. The third day after Christmas, I finally allowed myself to feel it fully. Not the hurt, the understanding. I sat by the window and watched the light change as the day went on. Morning light, afternoon shadows, evening dimness. I thought about the younger version of myself, the woman who believed that love was proven by sacrifice alone. She had done her best. I honored that, but I also realized something important. Sacrifice without boundaries slowly turns into invisibility. I didn't blame anyone, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even myself. This wasn't about blame, it was about awareness. I saw now that I had taught people how to treat me by always asking for nothing, by always saying I was fine, by always stepping aside. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me thoughtful. In the quiet of those days, I began to listen to myself again, to notice my own feelings without brushing them away. I asked myself simple questions, questions I hadn't asked in years. What do I need? What do I deserve? What would it look like to take up space again? I didn't have answers yet, and that was okay. What mattered was that I was finally asking. On the fourth day after Christmas, I felt something shift, just a little. The heaviness didn't disappear, but it softened. I made myself another cup of tea and sat at the table, not as someone waiting to be invited somewhere else, but as someone who belonged right where she was. I realized that healing doesn't come with apologies or explanations. Sometimes it comes quietly, when you finally stop ignoring your own heart. Those days after Christmas changed me, not suddenly, not loudly. They gave me space to see the truth without fear, to accept that love can exist and still hurt, that family can mean everything and still fail us in small ways. And most of all, they taught me this. I didn't lose my worth that Christmas morning. I simply noticed it had been waiting for me to claim it again. After the quiet days following Christmas, I began to see things more clearly. Not everything, not all at once, but just enough to feel a subtle shift inside me. I realized that waiting for an apology or waiting for recognition was not what I needed. It never had been, because my value does not depend on someone else noticing it. It never did. I started small, sitting in the morning sunlight, letting the warmth touch my hands and my face, feeling it on my skin, like a quiet reminder that the world still had gentle things for me. Even if no one else mentioned my presence, I made tea slowly. I chose my favorite cup, the one with a tiny chip on the rim, because it had been mine for years. I held it with both hands, breathing in the steam, savoring that small comfort. It was a simple act, but it reminded me that I could give myself kindness without asking permission. I began to do small things differently. I let myself walk a little slower on errands, noticing the world around me instead of rushing to make everyone else comfortable. I lingered in the grocery store, picking up fruits I liked, reading labels that interested me, smiling at people I passed without worrying if I was in the way. I noticed how much I had been shrinking for so many years. I had learned to make myself small in my own home, in my own family. I had been quiet so as not to inconvenience anyone. I had smiled so as not to be noticed. And yet, the world did not change. No one waited for me to claim space. No one reminded me that I belonged. That realization could have made me bitter, but I chose not to let it. Instead, I began to listen to myself again. The quiet voice I had ignored for decades started speaking clearly. It asked small questions. At first, what do you need? What makes you happy? What would it feel like to let yourself take up space again? I didn't have answers immediately. I only had the willingness to notice, to breathe, to exist. I started reconnecting with myself through small routines, simple walks in the late afternoon, noticing the way the sun filtered through trees, reading books I had set aside for years, letting stories fill my imagination, writing notes in a small journal, not for anyone else, just for me. Each word I wrote was a reminder that my thoughts mattered, that my feelings mattered, that I mattered. I began to smile again softly, not at someone else's happiness, but at the small moments that touched me. A bird landing on the windowsill, the smell of rain on the pavement, the warmth of a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. These were not dramatic things. They were quiet, and yet they were enough. Slowly, I began to think about my family differently, not with anger, not with resentment, but with understanding. I realized that people act out of their own limitations. They may not notice the quiet sacrifices you make. They may not understand how deeply you care. And that is not your failing. It is their own path, shaped by their experiences, their focus, their choices. I remembered that my love for them had never faded. It still lived inside me, but I no longer needed it to be returned in the exact way I had hoped. I no longer needed gestures to validate my heart, because I had begun to validate it myself. I started to imagine the next holiday, not with anxiety, but with calm intention. I would still be there. I would still participate, but I would carry my own space with me, my own presence, my own acknowledgement. I didn't need anyone else to remind me that I belonged. I had begun to remind myself. Some afternoons, I called my friends, just to hear their voices. I found comfort in their laughter. I shared stories from my life, not to impress, not to seek approval, but to release the weight I had been carrying, quietly. And when they listened, truly listened, I felt lighter. I also began to notice the way the world welcomed me in small, subtle ways. A neighbor saying hello with warmth, a shopkeeper remembering my favorite item, the sun reflecting on the window in a way that made the whole room glow. These moments reminded me that life still had gentleness to offer, even without grand gestures. I thought often about my family, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with clarity. I loved them still, deeply, quietly, but I no longer needed them to define my worth. Their recognition was not required for me to know my value. That realization brought a peace I had not felt in years. A soft, gentle kind of peace. It did not erase the hurt entirely. It softened it. It gave it space to exist without controlling me. I began to see that this kind of peace comes slowly. It is not sudden. It does not come from apology or recognition. It comes from acceptance, from self-respect, from noticing the quiet voice that has been with you all along. In the weeks that followed, I found myself smiling more often, not at the noise around me, not at the recognition of others, but at my own ability to notice joy, to carry it quietly with me, to choose calm over expectation, to choose presence over waiting. I even started preparing small gestures for my family. Again, gifts wrapped carefully, meals prepared with love. But this time, I did it without holding my breath for acknowledgement, without measuring my value based on their reaction. It felt different. It felt lighter. It felt free. And when I arrived at the next family gathering, I carried that calm with me. I joined the laughter. I participated in conversations. I gave hugs. I listened. But inside, I carried my own strength, my own recognition, my own peace. I realized then that life does not always give closure the way we expect. It does not always offer apologies. It does not always remind us that we matter. Sometimes we have to find that peace ourselves. Sometimes we have to be our own reminder. And when we do, we discover something beautiful. We discover that our worth is constant, that our love is constant, that our place in this world is never diminished, even if others fail to notice. I began to smile in quiet moments again. I began to love without expectation. I began to exist fully in my own space. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a gentle happiness that did not depend on anyone else. It was steady, calm, real. I realized that I didn't need anyone to apologize to feel peace. I didn't need validation to feel love. I didn't need recognition to feel whole. I had found it within myself. As the days passed after that Christmas, I began to carry myself differently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, with a subtle awareness I hadn't had before. I began to notice the way I filled my own space, how I held my head a little taller, how I allowed myself to speak a little more freely, how I no longer waited for permission to exist fully in my own home, my own life, my own heart. I thought often about the morning of Christmas, the empty pile of gifts, and the silence that followed. And I realized that pain does not always have to break you. It can teach you. It can guide you. It can quietly show you where your strength lies. I started small. I baked cookies for myself, not to impress anyone else. I made tea for just me, and I let the warmth fill the spaces inside that had grown quiet. I wrapped gifts thoughtfully again, but I no longer held my breath for a response. I gave love freely, because giving was part of who I was, not a measure of how others valued me. When I visited my family the next time, I carried that calm with me. I joined in the laughter. I shared in the meals. I held my grandchildren close. I listened to their stories, and I was present, truly present, without expectation, without need. For the first time, I felt whole in a way I hadn't realized I could. I understood that peace doesn't always come from others. It comes from within. It comes from accepting yourself, from knowing your worth, from understanding that being kind and giving does not make you invisible. I learned that family is beautiful, even when it is imperfect, even when they fail to notice the quiet ways you love them, even when gifts are forgotten or words are left unsaid. Love exists sometimes silently, sometimes quietly, sometimes only in the heart that chooses to keep it alive. That Christmas taught me something I will never forget. It taught me that my value is not in what I receive, but in what I carry inside me. It taught me that my love is not measured by others' recognition, but by my willingness to give it anyway. And it taught me that true peace comes from letting go of expectation and embracing presence. I want to leave you with this gentle thought. You are seen, even when no one says it out loud. You are loved, even when the world seems busy or distracted. You are worthy, even if recognition comes slowly or not at all. Take care of your heart. Honor your feelings. Notice yourself. Speak softly. Love deeply. And allow yourself to exist fully. Because that, in the end, is more than enough. And as I sit here now, reflecting quietly, I feel warmth. Not from gifts, not from praise, but from understanding my own heart. And that is a Christmas I will carry forever.